Is that, yeah, that's working, okay. Welcome to Defend Equality to Defend Democracy. I'm Charlie Swanson from We the People Eugene, and we're hosting today's event. I'm going to try to give a little bit of context to this event, connecting the notion of equality to democracy. Our country's founding documents exhibited a tension between inequality and democracy that continues today. I'm going to show how political inequality was enshrined in our Constitution. I'm going to list some subsequent things that made changes for the better and some things that made changes for the worse. I'll briefly describe our thoughts on how the 1976 Buckley versus Vallejo decision increases the oligarchic and plutocratic tendencies of our system. And I'm going to mention some recent things in Oregon which have made some improvements. But before I can do that, I have a public service announcement to make regarding health care. So as Martin Luther King Jr. said, of all the forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhumane. Many of you probably are aware that there's a special election in January, and the only item on the ballot is Measure 101, and you need to vote yes in order to protect healthcare for hundreds of thousands of Oregonians. So make sure you get your ballot back by January 23rd. So going back to my introduction, the Declaration of Independence states that all men are created equal. Actually, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. But our Constitution both accommodates inequality and enshrines it. The most egregious and inhumane inequality was slavery. And that was inappropriately accommodated in our Constitution with the most infamous clause in the document, the 3/5 clause. The repercussions of this still haunt our nation. Each state has 2 senators. So this means that Wyoming voters' voice in the Senate is 66 times greater than those of Californians. That particular thing is so enshrined in that inequality is so enshrined in our Constitution that it's the only thing that is explicitly prohibited from being amended. Because of the Electoral College, this also affects presidential elections, although it's only a factor of 4 because of the roughly equal representation from the House. Other democracy inequalities were simply unaddressed in our Constitution and left to the states. For example, women's suffrage, the Constitution was silent on women's suffrage for more than a century. And at the time of ratification, only New Jersey allowed women to vote, and that was actually rescinded in a couple decades. Voting rights, states are allowed, originally allowed only property owners to vote. Voting rights remain unprotected in our Constitution for the most part. There's some voting rights that are in there. Some of the founding inequalities were addressed, and impediments to democracy have been partially relieved, especially with the 13th, 14th, 15th, 17th, 19th, 23rd, 24th, and 26th Amendments. Also with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and also with the 1966 Harper versus Board of Elections Supreme Court decision. There have been efforts to make things more unequal as well. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the Powell memo. So quite a few people are actually familiar with that, but I will describe it a little bit. Lewis Powell in 1971 wrote a memo for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. In it, he advocated for businesses to become more active in molding society's thinking about government, politics, and our economic system. It led to the establishment of corporate-funded think tanks, whose purpose has been to strongly influence government and politics and society's thinking about economic issues. By any measure, the Chamber's been from the Chamber's standpoint, this has been a resounding success. Corporations have a huge influence on our political thinking and economic thinking. Nixon put Powell on the Supreme Court not long after this secret memo. The most important decision that reflects Powell's influence is Buckley versus Vallejo in 1976, which is often described as the money is speech decision, though it never really said that. The decision did recognize that in order to disseminate and promote speech, spending money is often required, and such spending is protected. As reforms are discussed, we want to ensure that our ability to spend small sums is protected in order for useful political discussions. As an example, We the People Eugene is spending a little bit of money to secure this venue, and we're paying a little bit of money for some speakers' travel costs. And we'd appreciate donations to help that. So if there's a couple volunteers from We the People that could maybe pass some cans around, and you feel free to donate as you're getting coffee or other things too. So we could use some donations. Is Fergus here? Oh, could you go back and get a can and maybe pass that around? Thanks. James, if you want to help us out too, that'd be wonderful. Thanks. So yeah, we do appreciate a little bit of help to with this venue and with the other costs of this event. So it's important to recognize that the 4 decades before the Buckley versus Vallejo decision were a time of decreasing wealth inequality, or at least relatively low wealth income inequality in this country. The 4 decades since Buckley versus Vallejo have seen increases in both wealth and income inequality. This is no coincidence. A current example of the effect of money on inequality is the tax bill working its way through Congress, which is going to promote inequality, enhance inequality, and is widely disliked by a majority of people. But congressional leaders have openly stated that the reason they're doing this is to secure funding, campaign funding from the wealthy and corporations. The infamous 2010 Citizens United decision, the 2011 Arizona Free Enterprise Club decision, and the 2014 McCutcheon decision have built upon the court's antipathy to political equality. In response, especially to the Citizens United decision, a number of groups have proposed constitutional amendments. The first round of amendments actually did not very well recognize the importance of political equality, although later versions of amendments have done much better at recognizing how important it is and how central it is to this discussion. It's not yet clear to us that the nuances necessary in an amendment that so directly affects our most important democratic discussions are as carefully crafted as they need to be, though there might be some disagreement with a few of those in this room. Many advocates have recognized the importance of building a broad-based movement to work against these plutocratic forces who will be fighting against a reasonable amendment. At this point, I don't think there's a sufficient number of advocates that have united behind a single amendment version to say it's broad-based, but people are working towards that. Perhaps part of the problem is that the simplified message that's best suited to creating a broad-based movement actually is not that well suited to writing a well enough crafted amendment for such an important task. So Oregon's been an important recent leader regarding some of the things that enhance political equality. Vote by mail, motor voter registration are important improvements. We also have a political contribution tax credit that is available. Most importantly, it's available for efforts that are unrelated to candidate elections, so implicitly recognize the importance of citizen initiatives. The credit could be improved by a method to access the credit as the contribution is made. So as you're filing taxes, if you could claim the credit on last year's taxes, that would be a huge improvement. And also by increasing its size for low-income Oregonians. So thanks for coming today, and now we'll turn to our guest speakers. The first speaker will be Kaitlin Sopoci-Belknap from the National Director of Move to Amend. And so, come on up.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you. I live in Sacramento, but I've been doing I guess I'll stand, a road show around Oregon this last week, and letting people know about what's up with Move to Amend. So Move to Amend actually formed before the Citizens United decision. We expected it to come down the way that it did. And we were a coalition of all of the organizations that have been working for the last 20 plus years against corporate constitutional rights or corporate personhood. And from our perspective, the underlying doctrines behind Citizens United are what we really need to get to with this opportunity to amend the Constitution. So the We the People Amendment is Move to Amend's amendment. And I'm not gonna read it, it's pretty short though. Our brochure here has it, and then we also have a strategic plan to get the amendment passed. We're the only amendment group that has a written strategic plan to kind of make really transparent and clear what our agenda is, and also to keep us on track. And so that's it. It's in either of those documents, and we're at the table back there. But basically, what it does is says that only human beings have constitutional rights. Artificial entities created by government, like corporations, but also unions or nonprofits, do not have constitutional rights. And then it also says that government at all levels, federal, state, and local, has the authority to regulate spending in elections, and also that any spending in elections has to be publicly disclosed, and that the judiciary cannot construe spending of money in elections to be equated with the First Amendment. And so our amendment was introduced in the House 3 Congresses ago for the first time. It's been introduced each Congress subsequently. We started this year with 24 co-sponsors in the House. We're at 51 now. Per our strategic plan, the goal was 35, and then next year's goal was 45, so we've beat all that, and we're gonna keep working, obviously, on the House. And our goal is to get the amendment introduced in the Senate this year, and I think we're actually not going to quite get there. There's been some stuff going on in Washington, D.C. that's been a little bit distracting. But we did just meet with one of your senators, Senator Merkley, but he has not agreed to come on, so you clap. But what you should also do is call him on Monday and let him know that we need him to introduce a companion bill to House Joint Resolution 48. He is one of our primary targets. His office has been receptive. I think the concern is that, this amendment isn't going to get passed through this Congress. None of the amendments are going to get passed through this Congress. And so as a senator, kind of trying to decide where to spend his time and what to come out on, he needs to hear that this is really important, and that while initially, it's going to, not go anywhere from a senator's perspective and be kind of more of a symbolic action, we need leaders to step up and take that symbolic action, that championship, and that's the only thing that's going to make this viable. And so I encourage you all to contact him. And then let me just kind of back up and make sure that everybody understands, kind of, again, from our perspective, the most fundamental point, because there's a lot of talk about money in politics, and obviously we've seen since Citizens United that the money in politics is off the charts and ridiculous, but also I think that there's probably no one in this room who would make the argument to me that in 2009, before Citizens United, we had a fair political system as it relates to money, and that big money didn't rule the day when it came to campaigns, and that everything was working fine, right? And so if all we're going to do with this amendment is overturn Citizens United and reassert that Congress does have the authority to regulate spending in elections, and that's it, then all we do is go back to, well, if they want to, maybe they'll do something like McCain-Feingold, which really was a pretty anemic campaign finance law and really wasn't serving us, the public, right? So on the money is speech piece, that isn't enough. We actually need to overturn that Buckley decision and make clear that the First Amendment does not mean that the people with the most money are the ones who are able to have the First Amendment the most or speak the loudest, right? And then, though, the whole idea that corporations have constitutional rights, what that means is that anytime we pass a law at the state level, at the federal level, like with McCain-Feingold and Citizens United, sometimes it's at the local level, anytime we pass a law trying to regulate or direct corporate behavior in some way, that law potentially is vulnerable to being that community is vulnerable to being sued, and then the law is vulnerable to being overturned in court with the argument that it violates a corporation's constitutional rights. So that's why so often meaningful environmental regulation is not even really on the table. We want to ban fracking. Well, we can expect that if we ban fracking, a corporation will sue us and say that violates their constitutional, maybe it's their 14th Amendment protection, and they're being discriminated against as a corporation. There have been other instances where corporations have been able to overturn environmental regulations, making the argument that the regulation violates their Fifth Amendment protections and that it's a takings of their property. And so what that means is that the local government that passed the law either has to pay for all the profits that the company would have made if they hadn't passed that law, or what that actually means is the community generally says, you win, we don't have the resources, and so we'll take that law off the books. And so it goes well beyond money in politics. It means that meaningful regulation of the most powerful economic entities that our government creates. Corporations are still chartered by state government, and so they're not inevitable. They don't have a right to exist. They're a form of doing business that comes with limited liability, and the trade-off should be that we can control what they do to make sure they're not harming us. But that's all off the table if corporations have constitutional rights. And so an amendment, comes maybe once in a generation, and we do have a ton of energy and momentum on the part of the American public right now. 80% of the public support reining in corporations through an amendment and addressing money in politics. We've passed ballot initiatives all over the country, including in conservative communities, rural, urban, doesn't matter. Black, white, Latino, doesn't matter. 80% of the American public want to see this happen. And we do know that, Congress has a tendency not to listen to what the American public wants. And so that's why Move to Amend strategy is to build a movement. The only way we've ever been able to amend the Constitution has been through a people's movement. It's not going to happen because we have some altruistic Congress people or state legislators. It's going to happen because we build a movement. And so we don't have a Move to Amend chapter here in Eugene right now. And I would love to talk with anybody who would like to help us get one started. We do have a group in Corvallis and in Salem and in Bend and in Portland, and I just was out in Astoria, and so we're going to get a group started there. And I would love to talk with anybody who wants to work with Move to Amend here in Eugene, and I guess there's going to be like a break in a time for us to do that, but you can come find me. And I encourage everyone to kind of pick up our resources, take a look, and give us your feedback and let us know what you think. And I am going to pass our petition, and if you would please sign it whenever we go and speak to your representatives, we let them know how many people in their district or in their state are calling for this amendment, and so your name on this list will help us show our numbers, and that's ultimately what sways them. I mean, the big money does too, but at the end of the day, they actually work for us, and I think, part of what we're seeing with powerful people being toppled in unexpected ways right now, we're on the brink of some big momentum, and so I hope you'll join us, and I don't know if that was 15 minutes, but you haven't dragged me off stage yet, so.
So at this point, we have a little bit of time if there were a couple questions that people might have for Kaitlin. We'll just do this, maybe like 3 questions.
Very short. What's the number of the House
48.
Bill?
House Joint Resolution 48, and the lead sponsor is Rick Nolan from Minnesota. So when you call Merkley, companion bill to House Joint Resolution 48. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. You mentioned corporations chartered at the state level.
Right.
I've heard of that. A corporation getting its charter revoked. What's the status of that?
That's still something that legally is a possibility. The corporation has to be chartered in the state where the either Attorney General or Secretary of State, sometimes legislature, it kind of depends on the particular state. But technically, we still have the authority to revoke charters if they break the law, or if we want to make the argument that they're not, that they're harming the public too much. There was a campaign back in the 90s to revoke Unical's charter, because Unical is chartered in California. Most large corporations are chartered in Delaware, and Delaware really allows a lot of latitude, and they also hide a lot of the details about corporations that are chartered there, and that's why corporations charter there, and then Delaware gets the incorporation money and kind of is screwing over the rest of us states. But if there is a corporation that's chartered in the state, you technically, either through the Attorney General or Secretary of State, could initiate charter revocation proceedings. It hasn't happened for centuries in other than a kind of administrative way if a corporation isn't acting anymore. But it really comes down to political will and political pressure, you know? And so if we, again, through building a movement and the momentum and energy and power to make our attorney generals say, actually hold our corporations accountable, that is a tool that we could add to our toolbox to hold them in check, sure.
Okay, we will do one more question. We will have a discussion at the end amongst many of the presenters, so there might be a little bit more time to ask questions at that point also. And we will encourage people to meet with Kaitlin during the break. So,
my question is that after the amendment is passed, then we may need to do further work on the way big money owns all the broadcast and cable channels and AM radio. They actually change public opinion by working on basic attitudes like the image and standing of soldiers and all this kind of stuff. And so how are we going to reach that with this sort of measure?
Yeah, so and that would be true in terms of the way that corporation, you know, you're talking about kind of the money piece, but they're on the corporate side of the amendment. No matter, anytime you amend the Constitution, there's going to be reverberations and, you know, implications in the law, and you basically we're going to need to pass legislation to be clear what role we want corporations to have or not have, what powers they should exercise. I mean, maybe it would make sense for there to be some level of, you know, protection from government, you know, just coming in to seize their books or something like that. And all of that is possible. So we actually have a campaign that we're just launching internally right now in Move to Amend to look at the model corporate codes that we would want states to put in place after the amendment passes. And I think that, again, this is only going to happen through building a movement. And so that movement, if you look at our strategic plan at the very end of it, it doesn't say like everybody go home and pat ourselves on the back because we got democracy. It actually says that now we begin to, you know, talk and convene with each other and figure out what it is that we would want now that we've laid a foundation that would make democracy possible. So you raise one of the points that would need to be part of that discussion, and there are actually many more. And that's actually very exciting, and that's what the kind of thing that we should do in a democracy, right? Be defining our institutions rather than letting them just kind of let us know what they're going to do or not do.
thanks, Kaitlin. So next we're going to have Phil Guidotti from Wolfpack.
My name's Phil Guidotti. I am the legislative director for Wolfpack, Oregon. Wolfpack's a group throughout the country of volunteers, state by state, working to pass Article 5 convention calls for an amendment to the U.S. Constitution on the topic of campaign finance reform. We're essentially responding to the situation where we have Congress people that are forced essentially to spend half their time fundraising instead of listening to their constituents and doing their jobs. And this doesn't mean they're bad people. Some of them are great people. They just feel like they have to do this to survive in their positions. We need to give them a better system. And we also are responding to, that's great. We're also responding to the fact that, you know, public opinion doesn't particularly affect public policy all the time. All right, we're talking special interest dominance in our government is what's leading in our policy decisions. And that's a fact that we just can't tolerate for our next generations. Love that, thank you, yes. I have 3 kids and I just ache for them, and we need to give them a better government than this. Wolfpack was started by Cenk Uygur. He's the lead anchor of the Young Turks, the largest online news show in the world. And he was disgusted with the situation as it is, and he too realizes that this is based in Supreme Court decisions over decades, as Kaitlin was talking about. I love everything Kaitlin was saying with Move to Amend. If we're going to deal with Supreme Court decisions, we need to go above them with an amendment. So we totally agree with that. Thank you, Charlie. There's two ways to get to an amendment. You can have 2/3 of each chamber of Congress, pass a resolution to propose an amendment, or the Founding Fathers give us a co-equal. In fact, this was the first path that they gave us in the framing, was an Article 5 convention call where states pass bills that basically identify a problem, a specific problem that they want fixed with an amendment. It goes to a convention, and the amendment is proposed there, and then 3/4 of the states need to ratify any proposed amendments coming from either place. So, I want to highlight the 17th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, direct election of senators. It's kind of similar to the situation we have now. Back in the Gilded Age, you had senators appointed, not elected, and they represented special interests in a major way. It was naked corruption. And what we have today isn't quite as obvious, but it's a gift economy that is definitely corruption, as you all know. We're still here. Yeah. So what happened with the 17th Amendment is you had the people rising up. You had state-level reforms. You had requests of Congress. You had protests. And you had a whole bunch of Article 5 convention calls being passed. They got to the point where it almost hit the 2/3 threshold, at which point the convention would have occurred. But the Senate, who had no interest in making this amendment happen, felt that pressure from all different groups and all different paths, and finally capitulated to the will of the people. This is a situation similar to ours today, and we want to follow that model. Patrick Leahy, he's a congressman in Vermont. When we passed our resolution in Vermont a few years ago, he held first congressional hearings on the topic of campaign finance reform. And his vision is the same as ours, working together with all the groups here today towards a shared vision of reforming our government and dealing with the corruption. And this is just a goofy slide to just lighten things up a little bit. Yeah, regardless of what side you're on in Congress, things aren't going well on campaign finance reform front, obviously. All right. Article 5 conventions aren't something most of us know much about. So just without getting too much of the weeds, just know that the Department of Justice has studied this along with the Congressional Research Service, American Bar Association, and they all conclude that a convention can be limited to a single topic, and that convention can be, those limitations can be enforced with a variety of mechanisms from the 4 different branches of government that are involved in the amendment process. I know it's kind of, I don't want to, and again, I can answer more questions about Article 5 because we could talk for hours on it, but I probably don't want to get too much into the weeds. And maybe I'll just end with the Article 5 part by saying that, again, it's really important to focus on the fact that Congress at any point can always choose to propose an amendment. So it is extremely likely that the closer you get to an Article 5 convention, with all these calls adding up, Congress is just going to propose the amendment themselves. And that is by far the most likely situation. While we feel very comfortable with the Article 5 process, the founders put it in place as a safety valve for when the government was unresponsive to the will of the people. So this is essentially exactly what they expected would happen. However, it is very likely that they will just propose the amendment themselves when they get enough pressure. So our bottom line, we like to talk about urgency, history, and courage. As far as urgency goes, I'm preaching to the choir here. Whether it's privatizations of prisons, gerrymandering, unequal schools, climate change, pollution, we have tons of problems that our government has shown pretty poor ability to deal with on a large scale. And we need to get to the foundational problem as soon as possible. that you know, there's just so much money, so much power with the wealthy and the special interest groups. We just need to get the power back to the people here, and we need to do it with every tool we've got. Okay, keep on going. One more, please. It's one more, Charlie. Yeah, and you can do a couple more clicks here. When we're thinking of history, so a lot of people don't know this, more than half of the amendments to the U.S. Constitution began with Article 5 convention calls. So while there's never been such a convention, it has precedence as a lever arm to force Congress into action. So historically, and you can click it a couple more times, whether it's state-level reform, protests, requesting Congress to do something, and demanding an Article 5 convention, you put all those things together, and that's when you get an amendment. So we want to work with all groups on this in parallel, pushing towards, you know, the same direction. So I love Nelson Mandela. As far as courage, what we mean by this slide is, if you do a risk analysis and you look at the status quo, I mean, you guys applauded at the beginning because you know the status quo is unacceptable. Our children deserve a government that actually responds to the will of the people. I mean, more than 90% of people in poll after poll want campaign finance reform in a major way, and yet they don't give it to us. It just doesn't happen. So if we're not going to get it, you know, I mean, we're going to have to pressure them hard. So the risk isn't not doing anything. You know, the right thing to do is to use all the tools in our tool belt to make something happen. Right, just check. You know how much, I got like 5 minutes? Yeah. Okay. So, and I want to end with speaking about how we can work together. So we at Wolfpack, we're very committed to unity and cooperation with other groups. We really want to focus on it, especially lately. We want to kind of reinvest in that. Just to be really candid, we've hit some obstacles in the past with passing legislation. We've had wonderful people in the legislatures like Senator Manning, who has been very supportive. He's been great. Yeah. He's been a great supporter, and we've had quite a few supporters in the legislature. But there's 100 ways to kill a bill, and there's only one way to pass it. All right? It's way easier for a bill to die in the state. And remember, we're on the state level, so I don't want to confuse that with Congress. We're talking, in our bills, we're working on the state level with state legislators to get our bill passed. So just in the interest of time, I just want to highlight that we all really need to work together. And in my last 3 years of working on this as a volunteer, I've found that our minds, the mind of a human being wants to see differences. All right, I look out in this crowd and my mind wants to say black, white, man, woman, tall, short, bearded, bald. I mean, well, this is what we do, right? We categorize people. We put them in boxes. Like if there could be a group of 1 million people and I could spot my wife's face without her saying a word, because we are so good at seeing the differences in each other. Right? It's like a social, it's a social survival mechanism. And we have to recognize that because it is so easy for us to see the differences in each other in different groups, all right, different reform groups. We categorize each other. Oh, I'm Wolfpack. Oh, you're this group, or you're this group. Oh, why are you different? Well, we do this and you do that, and we just tease all the differences because we want to like box everybody up. And this is just so important to recognize because I feel like we really have to transcend that. In my 3 years of working in the legislature as a volunteer, I've fallen into that tendency. And I just want to put it out there as a vision that if we can all together focus on speaking highly of one another, cheering each other's initiatives on from the sidelines, working in parallel, not necessarily on the exact same project, but in parallel towards the same future. And I just want to take a pledge. And I know my team, Jacob in the back, aiming on the camera. I've got a couple more, we got Wolfpackers in the room. We have all been on calls together, and we have all dedicated ourselves to speaking highly of other groups at all times. And we are going to live that vision of friendship. You guys can trust us that we're going to do that from now on. We're always going to find the common ground together, and we are not going to highlight our differences. All right? We're not going to fall into that trap anymore. So that's why we're all here, right? We're here for unity and cooperation together, and I want to live that, and I invite you to live it with us. So let's be friends, let's make this happen. And
thanks, Phil. I think in the interest of time, we probably will not have questions at this point. So next we have Dave Tvedt from Community Rights, Lane County.
Yeah, so I'm on the steering committee of Community Rights Lane County. I initially started out working with Freedom from Aerial Herbicides Alliance, and then which was kind of an offshoot of Community Rights. And we, as a number of you may know, large timber corporations spray aerial herbicides from helicopters all over Lane County. Their land is spread out throughout most of Lane County, and it adversely affects really everybody in the county, but particularly rural residents. And I evolved into appreciating more and more a community rights perspective over time. Everybody has probably heard reasons why there might be a little leery of a community approach, because sometimes communities want to take away people's rights and maybe actually even have an exploitive relationship with the natural world to basically line the pockets of individuals in the county. Our particular charter amendment that we have, particularly if it states that no rights can be taken away. We are trying to ban the aerial spraying of herbicides, and we ended up with 2 initiatives in Lane County. Just kind of the fickleness of the legal system, Lincoln County actually passed a ban on aerial pesticide spraying. It was broad, so it was all pesticides, not just herbicides. And their judge allowed them to keep the community rights aspect in with the ban of aerial pesticide spraying. But our judge required us to separate them because they saw us taking on the preemption aspect of our initiative was a different topic than aerial spray. So we ended up having to collect around 15,000 signatures on each, twice as many. Well, I'll get back to that. I'm going to go to the national level group, Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, CELDEF. How many of you have heard of CELDEF? Quite a lot, yeah. Great. They started out as a traditional environmental law group trying to protect different natural world things and reduce pollution and so forth, but they were getting more and more frustrated with that approach, and they found that the regulations they were basically stacked in industry's favor, and just from industry being able to co-opt legislatures and get legislatures to write the laws and the regulations in favor of them, they ended up losing in the end more often than not. And they'd fight different things like fracking in a local community or a big feedlot coming in, and then they'd fight them on legal technicalities, but then they got overthrown in the end because the corporation would adjust and meet those requirements, and then the community would lose out. And they initially started out in Pennsylvania, and a lot of the communities they represented were small conservative communities that they wanted to maintain their quality of life. They didn't want some horrible polluting industry coming in. And 2 of the most common ones were with fracking and with industrial feedlots. And when they As time went on, they got more and more frustrated, and they decided that we need to have a different approach, and so they went to a community rights approach where, in essence, it's a community standing up against preemption laws that the state or the feds put on them to stop them from being able to have a say on a local level. So like with our aerial spray ban, with our aerial spray ban, people have been trying for decades to get the legislature to rein in aerial herbicide spraying. And yet, there was success on federal land, so a lot of people have heard, oh, it stopped in the 80s. Well, that was just federal land, so BLM and Forest Service. Meanwhile, on all this industrial forest land and state forest land, the herbicide spraying has continued on. And it's been under the radar a lot. A lot of people living in Eugene, Springfield, aren't even aware of it. But almost every rural resident is aware of it in Lane County. It's just like ubiquitous. And anyway, we lost my train of thought there. So we're wanting to bring it back to the community and on a county local level have a say again, because the legislature, people have tried over and over again, different groups have tried to get the legislature to rein it in and at least provide some better protections, and it keeps on failing. The legislature, in our view, is pretty afraid of the timber industry and the big chemical companies. And when a legislator takes this on, they're way more likely to get targeted by giving their opponents getting more money and so forth. So it's a very difficult issue, and what the community rights approach is basically on a certain level, the community standing up to state or federal preemption laws. It's maybe a form of civil disobedience even, but if you look at all these different issues, you see it going back and forth on marijuana laws. Right now, Sessions and the feds are talking about coming down on states regarding marijuana laws, LGBT rights. Anyway, on a state level, CELDEF is actually involved international. I'll get to the state in just a minute. They are involved in rights of nature. They got rights of nature tied in with the constitutions of some countries and so forth. But they're supportive of our local groups, and we also have a statewide group, and they're supportive of the statewide group. We are trying to get an amendment to the state constitution that will take on the preemption issue. The state has, like the Right to Farm and Forest Act, basically preempts us from having any say on a county level in trying to protect ourselves from herbicides and these other poisons. And so we are working on a state level to try to get a state amendment, and that will be an initiative so the legislators can't block it. And then on a county level, there are a number of counties that are involved in trying to get different issues addressed. So with that, I wanted to bring up, we have been having huge troubles with our county commissioners. Our county is heavily gerrymandered, and in our view doesn't really represent our county very well. And 4 out of the 5 have pretty much shown that they want to block our initiatives. And so I'm going to ask all of you if you could help by showing up to the county commissioner meeting. It is on the 19th of December, 9 o'clock, and speak up to them. And I think this pertains to all of our causes because the county commissioners are doing the bidding most of them are doing the bidding of moneyed interests, and they will, whenever any of us working on whatever we're doing, if they don't like our cause and it isn't supportive of their moneyed backers, they're likely to block it in different ways. What they're doing is using, it's a very complicated court thing, but and I encourage you to come back to our table afterwards and talk more for getting some more, and maybe it can come up during the question and answer. But they are not having any transparency with even explaining to us why they applied an arbitrary rule. The judge said they didn't even have to apply. So they're going out of their way to use an arbitrary thing to block our initiative. And we actually have the signatures for the aerial spray ban. Our community rights one, the second one, is the one that says we have a right on a county level to have a say. So that we're virtually done collecting signatures on, and we're going to be submitting that soon also. But we would greatly value you showing up at the county commissioner meeting on the 19th and asking for them to have transparency and actually give reasons and stop blocking the democratic process. So I think we're run out of time, so I want to give Richie a brief thing on rights of nature.
Yeah, you've got 3 or 4 minutes.
Okay.
Hold this in a second?
Oh, hold it.
Not yet. You can hold off for a second. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Into the mic. Is that better? To reiterate what David said, we are a group of citizens, and we have worked our butts off for over 2 years to get to this point in a legal fashion to utilize the initiative system. And our county commissioners are standing guard on what we're trying to accomplish, which is simply give the people the right to vote on an issue. And if we don't have anything sacred around here, then we don't. But this is one of those things that is our last good, sound, direct democracy action is the initiative process. It is not easy. It is not at all easy. Please, if you can support us in any way, shape, or form, letters to the editor, or please come to the commissioners' meeting on the 19th. Okay, trying to make this short. I know you can hardly see it. I just wanted to bring it up here so you could identify it and get a chance later to look at it. This shows, if you can see the color, these are dates on the bottom here, 1750 to the year 2010, and these indicate, let me get over on the other side, David. These indicate basically earth changes and changes in the climate and so on and so forth. Here we have ocean acidification starting in 1850, where it was close to none. In a short period of time, 150 years, we've gone all the way up to a multiple factor of where it originally started: coastal nitrogen, terrestrial biosphere degradation. It's a dramatic chart, and it gives you a sense of how we people have modified geologic time to our consumption habits. Thank you, David. The Europeans came here to the East Coast and looked across this broad, vast island home to many indigenous people and thought it was endless and thought the resources would last forever. And there was a drive. I think it could not be better spoken than the words of Cortez, who said, "We suffer a disease of the heart, for which gold is the only cure." I think we suffer a disease of the heart for which consumption, gold, money, is the only cure. Otherwise, we're doing what we're doing. I'm not done. One more minute. Okay, this is near impossible because this is a complex and new, somewhat complex and new concept, the rights of nature. How many people have heard or are familiar with the rights of nature? There was a point in our group's evolution where we thought we can't talk about that, it's too woo-woo, people wouldn't understand it. And then waiting 2 years later, we started doing it, and everyone was, yes, corporations are identified as people. Why in the heck is nature and all of its wealth and richness and living variations, why is that not, why is she rather, because it's a living thing, why is she not given rights? It's incomprehensible. So can't quite figure out how to pursue this short amount of time. One more minute. Okay, thank you. The rights of nature means that nature has the right to exist and flourish, to regenerate and follow her own natural cycles. We think that this is the antithesis of the disease of the heart. This is a love of our home. I think a love of our home is a greater, with a love of our home would come a greater love of each other. I will suggest at this point that you come back here, come to the back to our table, and please talk to us. I feel really rushed here, and it's such a beautiful and far-reaching concept. But I'm going to give you a few places where people are recognizing the rights of nature. One is Ecuador. In September 2008, they voted into their constitution. Pittsburgh, the first major city to codify legally enforceable rights of nature. Bolivia, rights of Mother Earth recognized. New Zealand, water ecosystems gain legal personhood status. All over the planet. The Ganges and Yamuna rivers in India gain status as legal persons. New Zealand, land gains legal person status for an 821 square mile area. The Ho-Chunk Nation, native to Wisconsin, this tribal nation in the United States recognized in their constitution the rights of nature. So it is not a woo-woo concept. It could be our very survival and the health and well-being of people and the entire planet, and I hope we can talk with you more. Thank you.
Thanks, Richie. Thanks, Dave. So next up, we have Eric Richardson from the Eugene Springfield NAACP.
Greetings. So it's good to be here today and listen to Move to Amend and Community Rights Lane County. We're doing a lot of work here in Lane County. I just want to be humble and let you know that I'm a neophyte, when it comes to really being a part of this movement. And I want you to understand that I look out into the room and see that there is a lack of representation in our voting pool here today. And as you know, when election day comes, there's a lack of representation of the voters themselves. And so we've got a lot of work to do about participation. So it's good that we've got a lot of evidence. One of the things that I've heard coming up in my household, African-American household, is that, son, you know, a lot of the evidence has been collected for a lot of years. We know right from wrong. You know, people were stepping off of the slave ship in the 1600s knowing right from wrong, 100 years before the founding of this nation. And so the NAACP has a long history and a long memory, because we're 109 years old next year, but the people who founded it were maybe some of them had lived through the Civil War. And so the history and the motivation of the NAACP goes back to the very consciousness, to the soul of the United States of America. And as you see, that soul is being tested today. And a lot of what I think that we're missing is the education system of the United States has been under attack for many years, and education is the key to any civilization living up to its promise. Because without education, you're not reading documents, you're not really caring about the intricacies of laws and who is benefiting. You're really just trying to live day to day. And if you get right down to it, that's who voted in our president. People who live in day to day. These are people who themselves are in need of some assistance and I think the education system is the way that we will do that. And so, but it's got to be an education system that is well supported. And how do we support things in the United States of America? We support them through our taxes and through the government putting forth good policies and supporting those policies. So it's very important that in 2018 we step up, and I just want to be a voice for participation in this next year coming, that we get as many people coming out as possible. And that means stepping out of your silos like the brother talked about. He wants to work with people. He wants people to know that they're friendly. We need to let everybody know that we're friendly, and that and what we're really trying to do is build a nation together, not tear down one. And so the NAACP has a long history, and I'm just going to read it off. And if y'all want to stand up for a minute and shake it off, go right ahead. I think you should, because it's been a little stiff. But we are the largest, oldest, baddest, boldest, most loved, most hated, most feared, most revered, most cussed and discussed civil rights organization in America. And I think we all need to embrace, the reason why I did that is because we had an event Wednesday night at the Mims House, historic Mims House here in Eugene. Every Wednesday night, if you got time, come this Wednesday, next Wednesday. We got 3-4 left. We're going to wrap it up with a little Kwanzaa event. But last Wednesday, 2 Wednesdays ago, Charmaine Coleman was our speaker, and she spoke that night about having an attitude, and about having an attitude about what was right, about being self-righteous, about righteousness, and that we cannot accept when people disrespect us. And that as a black woman, she said that's what got her through, was having an attitude, being kind, and doing what you expect others to do to you. But when it wasn't forthcoming, let them know that it wasn't forthcoming and that it's unacceptable. Because so there needs to be a standard that we go by, and it has to be an interpersonal standard. If you can't treat somebody face to face, then how are we going to trust you to do something in the back room with the boys making up some legislation? We know that's not going to happen. So the real work that we have to do is interpersonal work. And so I just want to say, though, the NAACP, as of late, nationally, has recognized the need to modernize its methods, its communications, and its focus. And so towards those ends this year, they have moved a little bit towards environmental justice and understanding environmental justice from a different point of view. It was very interesting what the brother said about honoring nature, but we still have got a lot of work to do with honoring human beings. Because, yeah, you can say, oh, equal rights and whatnot, but there are black people in this town right here who do not feel like they are being honored as a human being. Their rights are not protected. And so therefore, there's work to do about that. And so I want to get involved with the environmental justice movement, but we have to acknowledge that white supremacy and racism has allowed the environmental movement to separate human beings from the environment and to glorify the environment while belittling the human being. And we need to reverse that course and understand that the human being belongs in the environment and must be nurtured by the environment and vice versa. So of course we have to preserve it, but we have to think about how we're going to do this when many of the people who we really need to serve are in urban settings. And a lot of them are in rural settings too, so I'm all for making sure that they're safe and not being poisoned. But but the same thing happens for the urban settings. And as the NAACP is concerned about people of color, we know that the urban settings, urban centers have not been addressed. And a lot of the information, a lot of the problems that we see in our nation are stemming from the lack of support in the urban centers. Just imagine if for the last 50 years we had excellent schools in all our urban centers, the talent and the invention and the leadership that we would have had by now, we would be a different nation. We are allowing this to happen and allowing people like our president and his ilk to thrive by keeping down our real stars and our real champions. We need to support those in the bottom. And I just want to end today inviting you all to the Martin Luther King march that's going to happen on Martin Luther King's 89th birthday in the 50th year of his assassination next year. And just talking about the little guy, I just want to recognize an environment and the urban center, that nexus between Martin Luther King and his final campaign, which was to support garbage workers in Memphis, Tennessee, who were not being respected, but who were doing the work to keep children and families and neighborhoods safe and clean. And they were not being respected and they were not being supported. Dr. King went there and was met with a bullet, and his life ended before his 40th birthday. And so we need to collect the evidence and understand that we can't rest on any laurels, and we need to continue this work of the United States, which is perfecting itself, understanding that those who benefited from slavery for hundreds of years, some of the companies are still with us today. When they lost the right to their profits through the ending of slavery in America, fought for many years, and now with Citizens United, were able to recap some of those profits by themselves taking on the 14th Amendment, which is an affront. Some of the very amendment that gave personhoods to black people after slavery, these corporations are using to recap their black people in the form of dollar signs, whilst neglecting that very community that gave them that money in the first place. The United States of America has a deep debt to pay to black people and to people of color, Native Americans and others, but also to our white residents and citizens too, for just underplaying the spiritual nature of our country. We've got work to do, and by changing course, we're giving taking everybody off a course. This is a spiritual quest. We're on our Declaration of Independence, and the United States Constitutions came about at a time when those type of ideas were not written on paper in Western civilization. But they were based on older ideas, and we need to keep going. They were based on ideas that came out of communities of color in ancient times, and they will go into the future supporting communities of color and all people. And that is something that we need to embrace. Change is here. Demographic change is here. We are one people. We all have a path that got us here that needs to be respected. But let's understand that through education we can make a difference, and so we got to start reaching out to people, talking to people, having strong, difficult conversations, and let's just move ahead together. So thank you guys.
Some handbills on the back table here, which explains in kind of capsule form the presentation that I'm going to give you today. So if you want to visit the back table, you can get some good information. And you might ask, why am I here today? I would like to know that the President of the United States that we elect was elected with a majority of the vote of the people in this country. I also want to know that my vote here in Oregon is part of that election. Right now it's marginalized. There is a way to accomplish this, and it's called the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, and I want to give you a quick trip through that activity today so that you can kind of put into context something that is probably below the radar of a number of you. And what is this National Popular Vote Interstate Compact? Well, it's an agreement between states. It is not a constitutional amendment. It's an agreement between states. And this agreement, if enacted by a sufficient number of states, would guarantee that the U.S. presidency is given to the candidate who receives the most votes across the whole country. And the way it does this is to harness two provisions in the U.S. Constitution that are already there. The first provision is the one that addresses the ability to be able to create compacts between states. There are many, many compacts that states have created up until this point in time, and it's explicitly provided for in the U.S. Constitution. And the second provision of the U.S. Constitution that it harnesses is the one that gives to the state legislatures the requirement that they engineer how the electoral votes that they're given by the Constitution, Oregon has 7 of them, how those votes are allocated. And there's wide latitude for the state legislatures to allocate those any way they want. So in your mind, think about these two constitutional provisions, compacts and allocation of the electoral vote. I want to underscore the fact that I am not talking about a constitutional amendment. I'm not talking about doing away with electoral college. So you may have heard rumors to that effect, but that's not what we're up to here. So take a look at this. The number of electors that we have in this country is 538. That's composed of the number, one elector for each one of the representatives, one elector for each one of the senators. And it takes a simple majority of those 538 electors to be able to elect the president. So if you do the math on that, you take 538 and you divide it by 2, you get 269. So it takes one more than that to be able to elect the president, a total of 270 electoral votes. This National Popular Vote Interstate Compact that I'm talking about is an agreement between the states for them to allocate their electors. Again, the Constitution allows them to allocate them any way they want to allocate them not based upon the state-by-state vote, which most of them do right now, but rather the total popular vote of the country. And so by having a compact between the states that comprise at least the number of 270 electoral votes, you de facto elect the president based upon the popular vote. And what it requires is that state by state, the states pass laws that state that they will allocate their electoral votes based upon the total vote of the country. You might ask, where are we today on this? We need 270 to be able to do this. Right now, states that comprise 165 of those 270 votes, electors, 165 of them have already passed laws, and they're on the books, to be able to allocate the electors in this way. It doesn't go into effect until there are states that comprise 270 of them. But right now at 165, so there only needs to be states that comprise 105 additional votes or electors to be able to accomplish this. So any of you who have not heard of this activity, you're probably surprised that we're already 60% of the way toward accomplishing this. So the question is, why do we even need to do this? Well, of course, immediately you kind of default to the 5 elections in the history of the country where the individual who became president actually did not have the popular vote. But that's not the thing that's most significant to me. I mean, it's very easy to wrap your brain around that. But the thing that's most significant to me is the other side effect of the existing regulation or existing laws, and that is it creates this state-by-state, winner-take-all kind of atmosphere that's associated with the elections. And it creates the so-called swing states, where there is a small number of states that a few votes, one way or the other, will make all the difference in the way in which the Electoral College works. And so that means that candidates concentrate all of their activity in those swing states to the exclusion of a state like Oregon. And I want to put Oregon on the map. That's kind of why I'm here today. There are other kind of side effects that go along with this state-by-state, winner-take-all kind of approach, and that is that even after a president would get into office, if you take a look at statistics on the disaster relief and other items which are flowed down from the federal government, it follows very closely those swing states because the regime that is in Washington at that point in time wants to pay homage to those swing states and keep them in the fold. So these winner-take-all approaches are not in the U.S. Constitution. They weren't enacted by the federal government. They were enacted by the states. And here, just quickly, if you scan down through this, the founding fathers left this decision to the states and so on. And it actually was in the very first elections after the country was founded. In some cases, the legislatures actually just allocated the electoral vote the way they wanted to. They didn't go to the people. They didn't even have a vote in the state. They just allocated them. So that's just kind of proof of the fact that the states can allocate them any way that they want to. Quickly talking about the constitutionality of this, because some people try to challenge it. This is an excerpt from the Constitution that reinforces the fact that the states have the exclusive right to be able to allocate their electoral votes any way they want to. And so if they elect to allocate the electoral votes based upon the total vote of the country, they have the latitude to be able to do it. They changed their own laws because they made their own laws. And the same thing with respect to the compact aspect of this, the fact that the states would come up with these agreements between them. This has gone in front of the U.S. Supreme Court at one point in time, and they have reinforced the fact that the states have the province to do this as long as it doesn't collide somehow with the federal government. And in this particular case, it does not collide with the federal government. It's something that the states can do. So it's constitutionally clean. What's going on in Oregon? You might be interested that in Oregon, 4 times the House of Representatives has passed the compact, which is associated with this NPVIC. In each one of those 4 occasions, the Senate has not brought it to the floor for a vote. And you might ask, why this obstacle in the Senate and so on? I believe it's exclusively associated with one individual, who is Senator Courtney, who is the president of the Senate. And he has a thing about this particular compact. And even in this last year, we really got blindsided by his activities against bringing the compact to the Senate floor, even though we thought that we had the votes in the Senate floor. But he is an individual, and by the way, one of our supporters is Senator Manning's, which I appreciate. So going forward, since it did not pass again in the Oregon legislature, going forward, our strategy is to not try to bring it up again in the 2018 legislative session. It's too short a session. The individuals have not changed. Senator Courtney is still in the same position. And it would be kind of futile to do that. So we've turned our attention now to the election in the fall of 2018, where it's always possible that Senator Courtney wouldn't be elected again for his particular district. Even if he is, we will be back in action in the session in 2019 to once again hopefully get it through the House of Representatives, and then perhaps the political atmosphere will have changed to a place where it can get to the floor of the Senate. There is a dimension to this thing that if you're a student of this National Popular Vote Compact, one of the ideas that has come out in the legislature in this last session had to do with whether the question of whether Oregon should enact the compact should be put in front of the voters. And of course, it's not politically correct for me to say that this is too complex a thing for the voters to understand and so on, but I will tell you, there's a lot of subtleties associated with this legislation. And if it gets put in front of the voters, I'm concerned, quite honestly, that that's kind of a poison pill in a way, that people not understanding all of the intricacies of the enactment of the compact and the implications for the presidential election, that they will kind of reflexively vote against it. And that would kind of be a shame. But you should understand that ballot referral is an issue that is kind of overlaying our activity going forward. We will probably be pressing against it, but there are powerful forces in the legislature, as a lot of you people know, that may not be able to we may not be able to withstand that. Okay, here's a list of supporters. NAACP is one of them. So we feel as though we have plenty of exposure to organizations that really matter in Oregon, but the legislature is the key to this. So what can you do? Well, stay alert for 2019. Become educated as to what this national popular vote interstate compact is all about. There's some handbills in the back. I would encourage you to take those, take more than one, give some to your friends and so on. And there is a website that has a whole series of videos that would be very instructive about not only the concept of the compact, but also there's a whole series of myths associated with this legislation that are explained in that series of videos. So thanks for your time. I'll be around for a little while if you have questions.
Thanks, Paul. Next up, we have a relatively short presentation from James Barber from Our Revolution, Lane County.
Thanks. I see a lot of familiar faces here. I think we're all here because we're involved and we're activated in our communities, and I want to thank you all for the efforts that you're doing in your community. Our Revolution, Lane County is a transpartisan political advocacy group. We're working on the 4 justices: economic, social, racial, and environmental justice. And we're trying to do that through engaging our community, educating our people, and activating them to take action on the issues. Issues like star voting, Measure 101, living wages, of course, and campaign finance reform. Now, we often get tied up in arguments in this country over big government and small government. I think that's the wrong argument. This is about a failure of government. And the failure of government is largely due to corporate control. Everything, all of these issues that we're fighting for can somehow be tied to the corporate control of our government. And so we end up fighting these battles individually. We figure out what our passion is, where our passions lie, and oftentimes people will say, why are you doing that? This is more important. You need to come do this. You need to work with me on this. And a big part of what we do is we want to get people together. We want to realize that it's through working together that we're going to amplify our voices. So 5 passionate people are going to make a much bigger difference than 100 people who don't really care about the issue that you have before them. So we need to support each other. We need to identify what our passions are, ask for help when we need it, and support the other people. We don't have to shame people for what they're working on. We're all in this together, and we need to change the conversation to say, how can I support you? And understand what you're fighting for and why you're fighting for it. And when the time comes, let's work together on that. I'm going to work on my thing here, and when the time comes, you can come help me with my thing also. And that's how we're going to make progress on this. Everything gets tied back to these corporations. We've got to figure out how to work together. There's so many issues that we're going to fight for. Just working together, that's going to amplify our voices. That's all I want to say. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, James. So we're going to take a break for about 15 minutes. We're going to start back up at 3:20 with the bus project.
Sweet. Can everyone hear me? Cool. Hi, everyone. My name's Gnora. I'm the Policy and Advocacy Director at the Bus Project. The Bus Project, so I got started in politics when I was 11 years old, knocking doors with my stepdad. He's a union organizer. And throughout my time as a young person engaged in politics, I think one thing has really rung true for me and a lot of my peers is that a lot of people try and tell us it's not our time yet, that we need to sit down and listen to the people who have been in office for a while, or listen to the older voices telling us, you know, how to vote, what to do, and how to get engaged. So there are a lot of young people today in high school, in college, who don't feel engaged, and they don't feel like they want to, cast a vote. They don't want to talk about politics. They don't trust politicians. And the Bus Project is all about changing that. So the Bus Project is an organization aimed to engage young voices in our democracy through voter registration efforts, through increasing access to the ballot, and through engaging those young voices in the change making that they want to be engaged in. So some of the things that we're working on, put my notes all the way over here. We're currently working on we're attacking the issue of money in politics. So a lot of times we have a lot of politicians who cater to wealthy donors, right? There's a small pool of wealthy donors in Oregon, in the country, and candidates often have to pander to those donors, which means that not everyone who wants to run or has a great platform or who could be a great candidate or elected official can run because they don't know who they don't know. And also, those candidates are then not incentivized to talk to the community about the issues that the community cares about and win over those community members by talking to them about what matters to them and getting them bought into their campaign. There's no incentive for that right now with the way that campaign finance works. So we're working on a program called Small Donor Elections to directly recenter our communities in the conversation about our democracy and our elections. So how that would work is that a candidate committed to small donor election programs would go out, raise money from the community, no more than $250 per individual, and then those funds would then be matched 6-to-1, which means that that small business owner or that restaurant worker or the student that can only donate $10 to a campaign, that equals $70. That means that that person's voice is that much stronger in the election that they're contributing to. So we're hoping, we did pass it in Multnomah County, and we're hoping to get it passed in the Oregon legislature to help make this a statewide effort, which is really exciting. We're also defending the integrity of our elections, like automatic voter registration. So automatic voter registration is a really big deal. In Oregon, I believe we were the first state to pass automatic voter registration, which is where you can go to the DMV and you are automatically registered to vote. The Bus Project championed this bill back in 2015, and when it passed, since then, we have had almost 400,000 people added to the voting rolls, and in the last election, over 94,000 people cast a ballot because of automatic voter registration. And we know that there's so much further to go, right? There are a lot of entities that people engage with on the daily, more so than the DMV, right? I'm 26 and I just went to the DMV for the second time in my entire life because I just had to renew my driver's license. There aren't a lot of people going to the DMV every single year when they change their address because it's like one of those things that you think about well after moving. So we're trying to both expand automatic voter registration and also defend it. We are working really hard with the Secretary of State to watch rule changes around our elections and the way that automatic voter registration is being implemented. We know that when we pass a law, it doesn't end when the governor signs it, right? You don't just stop fighting when the governor signs a bill. There's a lot that goes in to making sure that that bill is implemented in the way it was intended to be, that it's used in a way that helps the people and the lawmakers wanted to see it be used. And so we continually work with the Secretary of State to make sure that automatic voter registration is working in the favor of the people, and that everyone who is eligible is registered to vote through that program. And then the other thing that we're really, really focusing on is taking money out of the ballot. So right now, you get your ballot in the mail, and that's phenomenal, right? It comes to you. You can be super lazy about it. You know, you just have to check your mailbox. I sit at home on my couch, fill in my ballot with my pen, and then I drive it to the library. And I'm really fortunate. I live right by the library, and I work right by a county elections office. There aren't a lot of people that are as fortunate as me, though. There are a lot of people who live really far away from their drop box site. And stamps, I don't know a single human being in my life that owns stamps for the purpose other than turning in ballots. A lot of young people, we don't send mail, we text, right? So we're trying to make sure that there's not a poll tax on our elections, right? That we're not paying money in order to turn in our ballot, that those people out in, Deschutes County, in Jefferson County, in Malheur County, that they can get their ballots in, that those students that are at Western Oregon University and Southern Oregon University have access to the poll, and they don't have to, take a road trip with their friends to the post office just so that they can get their ballot in on time. So those are the three things that we're really focusing in on. We're also a member of A Voice for All, which is a coalition working to pass small donor elections and making sure that there are no ballot barriers to the ballot. So again, that's prepaid postage and prepaid postage and automatic voter registration. Those are the two big barriers to the ballot. The other thing that we know is that the Secretary of State is imposing a lot of rules, not only on automatic voter registration, but they have a lot of power over the ways that we gather petition signatures, right? They have a lot of power over a lot of things related to elections. And so we're working really hard to make sure that those rules that are being implemented best serve our communities and aren't being used for the better of, small, very, very small interest groups in certain areas in Oregon, right? That that the rules are being implemented to better serve all Oregonians and not just a handful of few. So that is all I have for what we're working on, but I would love to take questions because I think I'm an interactive person. Great, I have lots of time. I have some time. Yeah. So we did pass it in Multnomah County, and it should be implemented, I think, in 2020. Yeah. We're working still on implementation, so there's some things going on with Multnomah County, but yeah.
Hi, I have a comment. Having been a social worker here in Eugene, one thing that I discovered is a lot of people think that when they lose their housing, they can't vote because they don't have an address, and that's just not true because we have the mail-in ballot. So it's really important that we educate the homeless community that they can vote. They just have to provide an address where they regularly pick up their mail. Another thing as well is the organization Disability Rights Oregon has a committee that helps people vote. So it doesn't matter what your disability is, they have alternative technologies, and they'll even personally come to your home and walk you through an online ballot if that's what you need. So people with disabilities also have that as an alternative to vote.
Yeah. Yeah, just to kind of respond to that, not only are houseless people experiencing houselessness affected and believe a lot of the time they believe that they can't vote. I actually go out on the street a lot with interns and volunteers and do a lot of voter registration, especially at MAC stops and public libraries. And people experiencing houselessness often say, oh, I can't vote because they don't have a house. Well, they just need to put the address where they spend the most nights as their voting address, or Oregon residence, and then a place they can receive mail as their mailing address. The other group of people who so frequently believe that they are not able to vote in Oregon are those who have previously been incarcerated. And in Oregon, any person who is not currently incarcerated is eligible to vote. However, there's a caveat: you're not automatically re-registered once you're released, meaning that those folks need to be talked to and engaged and re-registered to vote once they are eligible in order to start receiving their ballots again. We've been working a little bit with PSJ, which is, I'm really bad at people's acronyms, but I think it's Partners for Safety and Justice. Sweet, getting a head nod from Senator Manning, great. to make sure that we have language related to folks who are experiencing not only houselessness, but folks who are previously incarcerated, to help that conversation on the streets for voter registration.
I just thank you for, yeah, all that information. And yeah. Yeah. And it seems like the youth are really more engaged than they possibly have been in the last 10 years or so right now. Do you know what the percentage is in Oregon, like the last election, or what percentage of the voting population they are in, let's say, 30 and younger? Is that?
Ooh, I don't know that, but I do know that across the United States, only 50% of eligible young people are registered to vote. So actually, a huge amount of what my job is going into high school. So I go to high school social studies classes, and I actually engage with them for an entire class period where we talk about issues that they care about. A lot of times they're talking about, they want to talk about, you know, immigration, LGBTQ rights, reproductive justice. We unfortunately can't talk about anything that might threaten someone's own personal identity, so we usually steer them to, you know, cost of student loans and climate change. And then from there, we demonstrate democracy, and then without them knowing, I only count the votes of the folks who are actually registered to vote and turned in their ballot, and I randomly assign that at the beginning of the class period. And doing that activity demonstrates the power of the small few that actually take those steps to be registered and then further on turn in their ballot. And from there, I'm usually able to register almost every single student in that classroom because those students really understand how important it is to not only talk about the issues, you know, on social media with their friends, but that doesn't really go very far unless you're actually engaging in your community and turning in the ballot, and then also visiting your legislatures, making calls, writing letters. That's what the Bus Project is all about.
Thanks, Gnora. So the next group up is going to be Equal Vote Coalition, and Alan Zundel and Mark Frohnmayer will speak about that. And I think you have a presentation. So you can share there's 2 microphones if you want.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Alan Zundel. When you think about equality and democracy, the topic that leaps to mind, first of all, is the role of money in politics. And we've heard a lot of people today talk about that, and I agree with them. That's a very big problem for those of us who have been around for a while and paying attention. And I was a political scientist for most of my professional life, so I was sort of paying attention. We know that this was a big problem decades ago, and it's only grown exponentially worse over time. So I applaud all the groups that are presenting different solutions to this, and I agree with the young man who was standing up here earlier when he said that we need to support one another and pursue many paths because they're complementary, and at least one of them may gain traction. Hopefully all of them will gain traction and get somewhere. Okay. Now, even though I was aware of the problem of money in politics for a long time, what I wasn't so clear on, and it took a while for me to understand this more deeply, was that that problem, as well as a number of other problems in our governance, is directly connected to the voting methods that we use in this country. Around the world, there's several different ways of voting. And by that I mean ways of filling out ballots, counting the ballots, and then determining who's the winner. In the United States, we seem to be committed for some reason to the worst of all of them. And that is systems that use plurality voting. A lot of citizens here make the false assumption that somebody has to get a majority of the votes to win. A majority means more than half. That's not true. You need a plurality. You only need more votes than any other candidate. Now, the upshot of that is that if you have a large set of voters who have similar views and would constitute a majority, but more than one candidate is appealing to them for their votes, they could fragment their votes among several candidates, allowing a candidate that they all hate to win the election. This is the spoiler problem that I think most of us are familiar with over time, and the upshot of that is to avoid the spoiler problem. Plurality systems result in a strong two-party system. You got two dominant parties and a lot of little parties that never seem to get very far, and independent candidates who sometimes crop up but also have trouble winning elections, okay? When you only have two main parties, it's much easier for big money to influence those parties. All you have to do is build relationships and gain influence over those two parties and not a variety of parties. And even worse, if there was an easy potential for new parties or independent candidates to get started, you'd always have to worry if voters were disgruntled with the way I was steering these parties, they could form a new one and they could pose a threat from a different direction. So as long as you have two main parties, you're going to have influence and money over those parties. There's a lot of other problems that's associated with two main parties as well. One of them is that just like in a market, when you have two strong corporations, they're going to become more interested in squelching upstart operations and less interested in actually pleasing the consumer, which in this case means you, the voter. They're going to be more attentive to protecting their position, their own self-interest, and more interested in their funders than they are in the voters, which is what we're seeing. You also have more partisan elections, and we've seen over the decades it's become worse and worse. There can only be two positions on each issue. You can't have somebody else saying, well, there's a third way or a fourth way to think about this. So a lot of these problems all revolve around the system of voting that we've become attached to. As I said, there's a lot of different voting systems in the world. So when I was a political scientist, I looked around and I thought, well, which one could have the potential for getting passed in the United States to change what we have here? And I settled on ranked choice voting, which used to be known as instant runoff voting. And I spent about 13 years supporting that particular reform, and in fact was very involved last year in helping to pass a measure in Benton County to get ranked choice voting instituted there for the county elections. But this year, I got involved in discussions with Mark here, and he has been promoting a more recently developed voting system that originally was called score runoff and now is called star voting. STAR stands for score, then automatic runoff. And at first I was skeptical of this, and I tried to poke holes in it and spent a lot of time talking with different people about it. But eventually I came around to the position that this is indeed a superior system to the other voting systems that I've been aware of. So I've joined with Mark to initiate a petition to get on the ballot in November of 2018 and change the method of voting for elected county officials here in Lane County to star voting as a proving ground for this concept. We've also got a parallel campaign going up in Multnomah County. Okay. The interesting thing about star voting, there's a lot of interesting things about it, but it developed out of conversations that Mark was involved with that had proponents of different voting methods discussing them. And somebody made a remark along the lines of, well, if you just took that part of this system and added it to my system, well, then it would be better. And Mark was thinking about this, and he developed star voting, which incorporates elements of several different voting systems that might be more familiar. It has elements of top two and the automatic runoff from instant runoff voting, and also scoring candidates on a scale. So these work together to enhance the strong points of previous systems and mitigate the weak points of those systems. So in essence, even though this is a new concept and hasn't yet been used for a public election, it builds on over 100 years of knowledge of previous voting methods, where they fail and where they're strong. So I'm going to let Mark talk to you about exactly how score runoff, or star voting now, how star voting works, and we're going to ask for those of you who are interested in this to help us out with it. We can use volunteers, we can use donations, and we can use further speaking engagements to other groups to get the word out. Okay, Mark?
Thanks, Alan. So star voting actually, it came out of a conference that we had at the University of Oregon Law School in 2014 called the Equal Vote Conference. We had people from all over the country, folks from the Center for Election Science, folks from Fair Vote, the two pro and con campaigns on Measure 90. It was a full day-long debate, and really out of that debate came this new system. And it's really simple. So it uses a scorecard for candidates. Instead of, you're not ordering the candidates 1, 2, 3, and you're not just picking your one favorite, but like rating a song on iTunes or a product on Amazon or an Olympic candidate or whatever, you score. I mean, scoring is something that's familiar to all of us from the first time we got a bad letter grade on a paper in grade school. And so it's that basic idea of assigning an independent measure of value to each candidate is entirely understood. The tiny twist that star voting adds is that automatic runoff. And what that is that in star voting, the two candidates who come out the highest on the overall scores, so you rate all the candidates 0 to 5, like 0 to 5 stars, and then the two who get the highest overall scores go on to this automatic runoff, and in that runoff, your full vote, your one vote is assigned to whichever of those two you gave a higher score. And what that does in practice is it eliminates the strategic elements of the voting process. It makes, there are all these ways that people have proposed that you could tactically vote in scoring systems, like by just supporting one candidate or by maximizing the scores of all the candidates on your side. And what the runoff does is it gives you this incentive to behave much more honestly so that if you actually have a preference difference between two candidates, that you're incentivized to give them different scores. So yeah, these are the rules of star voting. You score the candidates, the two who get the highest scores move on to the automatic runoff, and in that runoff, your full vote goes to whichever one you gave a higher score. So the ballot could look something like this, A, B, C, D, E, F, and if you leave a line blank, it counts as a 0. You can give two candidates the same score. So if there are two people you really like, you can give them both 5s. If there are two candidates you really don't like, but maybe there's one that's even worse, you could give two candidates a 1 and one candidate a 0. It basically just maximizes your expression on the ballot. So instead of having to choose, I mean, what we have right now is the worst kind of strategic voting ever, which is voting for the lesser evil. Right now we have to vote against, if our favorite is not one of the two major candidates, then we have to vote against our true favorite candidates and support someone we kind of like a lot more than the one we really think is just going to drive things off a cliff. And so what star voting really allows us to do for the first time in this country in terms of political elections will be to really express whatever level of nuance we want. Now, if you're like, hey, I actually just only like one candidate on the ballot, no problem. Give that candidate a 5, move on to the next office. But if you have a secondary candidate, you can say, I like that secondary candidate almost as much as my favorite, or I like that secondary candidate just a little bit more than 0, or anywhere in between. Totally up to you. And then again, yeah, if you voted the same for two candidates and then those two went on to the runoff, you're essentially abstaining from that choice. So the results, the other nice thing about this system is that when it comes to showing the results, if a lot of the more complex voting systems that let you rank candidates and then have many rounds of elimination, when it comes time to actually show you what happened in the election, the results are really complex. So they'll have these like giant tabulated spreadsheets and then multiple rounds, and you look at them and you go, I don't know what just happened there, but I guess that guy won. With star voting, you go, there's the list of scores. How did everybody do? These were the top 2, and more voters preferred this one over that one. So, in this case, if Desi and Bianca were the 2 highest scoring candidates, then this ballot would count for Bianca in the runoff because this ballot scored Bianca higher than Desi. So when it comes to the things that the Equal Vote Coalition is interested in, equality, that has to do with if you express your vote in one way, is there always another way that I can express my vote so that our two votes balance out? And we know that this is the fundamental inequality in our current system, because If there are 3 candidates running, I like 2 of them, you like 1 of them, then you essentially have twice as much power, twice as much weight to your vote as I do. In star voting, because the election is on each candidate, you get to have an expression, then for every expression, there's a counter expression. Honesty has to do with the not giving tactical voters some kind of special advantage. So in star voting, an honest vote is a strong vote, and trying to be sneaky is actually more likely to backfire than it is to be successful. This has been now vetted over the last 3 years. It's been out there amongst the voting scientists of the world. People have been taking shots at it from every possible direction, including Alan and a whole host of people just saying, well, what if this happened? Well, what if this happened? And from my perspective at least, and I think one of the reasons that Alan really jumped onto this particular reform effort in as much as he's a chief petitioner, is that it has withstood some serious critical analysis, and what's more, the folks who have characterized it sort of algorithmically against tons of different voting systems, it comes out right on top. And again, to the point where there are a lot of theoretical systems out there that just have very complex counting algorithms, but something that's really important for a new voting system is that people actually understand how it works. And the name star actually includes the entire system, score, then automatic runoff. So those are the 2 phases. There's a scoring, then there's an automatic runoff. You can see both phases in the outcome. And at the same time that it's very simple, it also lets us be incredibly expressive with how we, as individuals, express our civic voice. So we'd love to have you all on board. We've got an email address where people can sign up. In the very back there, Linda has a sign-in on a clipboard, and you can learn a lot more at the Equal Vote site, equal.vote. Happy to take any questions if we have any time. All right.
And so at this point, I'm going to invite all of the presenters who wish to come up and be involved in a further discussion to do so, and for Senator James Manning to come up. And so, Senator Manning, feel free to interject comments or whatever you want to do here. So it's sort of your show at this point. Thanks.
Okay, Charlie. Thank you so much. And again, thank everyone for coming out. This is very meaningful. How do we retain or develop our democracy that's going to be representative of the people and what the people expect from our elected officials? Before we begin, just a little bit something, I like to do one little clarification about myself. The term politician, I don't look at that. I don't particularly care for that. We've heard examples about what a politician is. Most of them are for hire, for pay. I do this because I'm concerned about people. I consider myself as a public servant, which means that I work for you, and I'm concerned about your needs and what you expect out of me. And I will always be there for you anytime you need me. So we got a marvelous panel up here, and the first thing I would like to know from the panel to get this thing started, with today's climate in Washington, D.C., what do you think has to be addressed and corrected? And if you wouldn't mind, just keep your answers really short. What is the thing, based off of what you are looking at, do you think have to be addressed right now because there is a critical need? And we'll start at the table and on the end and kind of go around.
I was hoping you wouldn't call on me first.
Well, you're looking at me, so I figured that you wanted to be first.
Huh? Somebody else want to go first?
Sure. I think corporations and moneyed interests, just in general, and it's very complex, but they need to be reined in. They really have taken over the political process, and I think their corporate personhood and a range of different issues that give corporations power need to be addressed.
Can I go now? Reiterating again what my comrade is saying, there's a simple chart, and it looks like this, if you can picture it. corporations on top, the government, and the people on the bottom. Wrong. It's supposed to be the people on top, the government, corporations. When we get there, it's going to be a whole new world.
I totally agree. And as we go forward, there may be some new people that have not been introduced to our panelists. So please give your name again and the organization that you're with.
David Tvedt with Community Rights Lane County and the Freedom from Aerial Herbicides Alliance.
Richard Gross, Community Rights Lane County.
James Barber, Our Revolution, Lane County, and I agree, corporations are the problem. There's the challenge is figuring out where do we start with the corporations. I think campaign finance is probably where we need to start. They have the biggest influence there, along with how we do the voting. Star voting would be a great way to start to limit what that money can do in politics. So.
Gnora Gumanow with the Bus Project. Well, I do agree that corporations are a huge issue. I think a larger issue is lack of engagement and lack of centering our communities in the conversation. Not only do young people need to feel empowered to use their voice, but our marginalized communities also need to feel like they're being heard in a way that I don't think they are right now.
I really believe that it's a social narrative that we have in our nation needs to be addressed and changed, and acknowledging that we are all in many ways marginalized by this situation right now, and we need to get a social narrative that supports people against profit and greed.
Okay, your name.
Oh, excuse me. Yeah, I'm Eric Richardson with the Eugene, Springfield NAACP.
So I don't disagree with anything that my colleagues have said. I guess, personally, I actually think that corporate capitalism is the root of the problem. Corporations are just a tool. So there are some corporations that are not really doing anything bad, right? But corporations able to use the law to thwart our efforts to make our communities better, to right the fact that this is a country that is founded in racism and genocide. All of our efforts towards that are used against us by, yes, big money, but I actually think that it's kind of more perverted than that. I think the fundamental problem with the United States is that we did not correctly define who is a person from the beginning. And so we had a history of movements needing to be built to drive ourselves into the Constitution, all of us who were left out. And then wealthy corporate owners were able to kind of hijack that logic and usurp our movements and our efforts through corporate personhood. So. Oh, and I'm Kaitlin Sopoci-Belknap with Move to Amend.
All right. My name is Phil Guidotti with Wolfpack, Oregon. And I, again, just want to emphasize, banding together towards a common purpose. But if I had to single out one thing on my mind, just assuming I want good people that go to Congress to enter a culture where they can fulfill the needs of their constituents and not enter a culture where they feel like they need to spend all their time, speaking to special interests, wealthy individuals. I want a system where they feel like they have to fight for the votes of every one of us constituents and be responsive to us again, and thereby reclaim our representative form of government. So.
Alan Zundel, the Equal Vote Coalition, and there's been a lot of good things said already, so I'll just add this part. It's always important in a democracy to have citizens who are motivated, activated, and educated. And I think the thing that mostly needs to be done is for all of us to take responsibility for that happening in ourselves and that happening in the people that we are in relationships with. Particularly, we need a style of politics that moves away from this, all this blaming and scapegoating various groups and treating different citizens as though their opinions are not worthy. We need to learn to listen, to talk in a more civil manner, while also being honest and straightforward about our views.
Excellent, excellent. Here is what I would like to do, and I know that we have limited time, but what's really important to me is to make sure that I'm engaged with the people of the district that I represent. So I go to and I attend a lot of functions just to listen. So what I want to do right now, since this is a pretty new format and we've got a bunch of we have an excellent panel up here, I'm wondering if who would like to ask a specific question to a specific panelist so that your voice is heard, which is really unique. And I think that's important because oftentimes we go out to a lot of these events and we hear the panelists, but we never get a chance to ask our questions of these experts that are up here. So.
Move to amend. I've forgotten your name, Mr. Kaitlin. The reason I'm here and the reason I'm involved in politics is because I'm opposed to war. And my country has gone to one war after another since World War II. And none of the wars were self-defense, and I'm fed up with it. We've killed millions and millions of people. And so that's the issue that I want to have fixed. So we'll move to amend. Will this prevent us, will this sort of reform actually have us not have another war in 5 or 10 years? Because we seem to have the wars over and over again, and nothing has been reformed. And we're just cruising for the next war.
Yeah, well, I think there's definitely a connection. When the amendment is passed, it would allow us to, pass legislation to make clear, kind of what role we want corporations to have. And so we could, ban corporations from the political process. We could also, limit large corporations from contributing, large amounts of money, et cetera. I mean, I would say that the reason why we're going to these wars is for colonization, and Halliburton wanted us to go to Iraq, and so they got their folks in government so that we would. And so the connection there is corporate power, and by putting corporations in their proper place as it relates to the Constitution, I think that would allow us to get them out of the conversation, and we wouldn't have a government that's agenda is the profit motive of corporations. We talk about it a lot of times in terms of we live in a system of corporate rule, not people rule. And that's because corporations are writing public policy decisions and making public policy decisions, either through lobbyists or sometimes just in their boardrooms. And so the amendment would not mean like, okay, and now we don't have wars. But I do think that this is the most strategic step we could take to move towards people actually controlling our government. And then from there, Americans didn't want us to go to Iraq once they found out what we were doing there, and most of the wars that we have fought have not been, popular once people kind of find out. And so, and there's any number of policies that Congress or the president choose to, do that are not what the public would want. And so that's the big issue. We're not in charge of our government. So how do we get there? Well, we get the folks who are to be in their proper place. Do you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to add and ask the senator something as a military person. So part of what I see as the problem is the privatization of the military, and that we continually, from the 80s on to today, we've brought in a lot of privatization of jobs that used to be done within the military, which really does impact marginalized communities and people the military is really a way out of the economic hardship. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to the privatization of the military and where is that going and how could we curtail that?
Thank you very much, sir. Before we get to the question, very interesting, and you're absolutely correct. Without going into a long history, this was part of the current state of our military is a part of the drawdown that we did after the Cold War. With the Soviet Union disbanded and how they created Russia and all of those Baltic states and stuff departed, went on their way. Well, part of was the denuclearization of these superpowers, which means that we were scaled down on the military. The military at one point used to have its own fire departments. They were all military folks. all those things, the cooks, the dining facilities, all those things are run by the military. What they've done is that to reduce the military, they gave those out to private contractors. Halliburton, some of those others are getting big whacks of that. And they've also scaled down some of the elements that are associated in the military. For example, they took some of the elements that were active duty and they moved them over to reserve or National Guard. So that's one of the reasons why you're finding that your National Guards are being called up so regularly to augment the active duty forces. So it is true that they've done it like that, and one of the reasons that they did it like that was because of the agreement that was done during the Cold War era that both of the superpowers would scale down their militaries. What's happening with that scale down is corporations have come in through lobbyists in Congress, and they've taken over Halliburton, Northrop Grumman. All of these big defense contractors are now getting a major part of that, and oil and some of the other things that you suggest are driving forces, because it has come down to corporations and their ability to pay off more our federal legislators in order to get these big contracts and stuff. So you're absolutely correct.
I'd just like to say in regards to war, I think probably most of the wars happen for resources, whether it's people need more space, people need oil, food, whatever the case. It has to do with resources. And if we want to see a big change in our foreign policy with regards to war, we need to get off the oil. If we move to wind and solar energy, we don't need to invade anybody for those resources. And that's going to make probably the biggest difference, at least for the current wars that we're engaged in.
Okay, so another question back here.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Yeah, hi. My question is mainly for Kaitlin from Move to Amend. And it does have to do with this whole idea of corporations taking on the rights of people and then having money act as speech so that they can purchase our Congress people. And I see that you and the Wolfpack, Phil, you guys have the same type of goal, which is to amend the Constitution to kind of outlaw this, you know, what seems to be bribery. And it seems to relate to many different issues, from health care for all, we can't have that, or why we're going to war, why these are being made is because some people feel like corporations are influencing our Congress people in a way that they're listening to them more than the people. And I was just wondering specifically, Move to Amend and Wolfpack have the same goal, but how are you guys, how are your approaches different, and how are you both working together since we have the same goals?
Yeah, good question. So let's see. Move to Amend's perspective as it relates, I think the Constitutional Convention is sort of the key point there. And I don't want to speak for Phil, so you can explain that part. But Move to Amend's perspective on the Constitutional Convention is that we're definitely not opposed. I think Phil made some really good points about how, with the 17th Amendment especially, threatening a convention might be the only thing that would make Congress act, and we totally see that. And then also, I would add that the Constitutional Convention option is sort of the most populist and democratic way to amend the Constitution. And so just saying we would never want to do that because that's scary seems like a really bad idea to us. I mean, we would definitely want to keep the option of a more direct way to imagine making a better Constitution. Having said that, though, we don't think that it will be either possible or would be a good idea to try to push for a constitutional convention without building that people's movement. The extreme right is interested in having a constitutional convention as well. And yes, for the balanced budget, but there are folks like Steve Bannon who are, white supremacist Nazis who would love to use a convention process, even one proposed by others, to sort of tag on and try to further an agenda of, I'm telling you that in this country, in this moment, there are folks who, no matter who called a convention, if we were able to have one, there are folks who would jump on that and try to use that as an opportunity to move forward an agenda of hate. And so our concern is, have we built the power to make sure that that wouldn't happen? And so, and likewise, Congress isn't going to do anything unless we build the power to make that happen too. So our perspective is we need to build that movement, and the fork in the road to decide which method to make it happen kind of hasn't happened yet, and so we're not as worried about that. We totally think that it's great there's a group that's talking about the convention, because that needs to be part of the conversation, so we thank Wolfpack for that and appreciate all the research and work that you all do to help explain that. But, and I understand the whole like, oh, but we could make it a single issue and we could direct that. But there are state legislatures that would be part of that conversation and process who have the power to introduce other concepts. State legislatures that are run by white supremacists and people who would like to get rid of abortion and people who would like to kick all immigrants out of this country. And so my one question that I often ask to Wolfpack folks, and I think we need to figure out together, is when people of color, when immigrants, when women, when poor people are saying, we're worried about a convention, we can't have the answer be, hey, we gotta just trust the American public, it's gonna be okay. Because Donald Trump is our president, and I've heard Wolfpack leaders say, hey, we should just trust the public, it's gonna be okay. So I think we need a better answer than that. And we're interested in kind of figuring out how to do that together, because it is the most democratic way. And the Constitution has a lot of flaws. The Constitution was written by slave owners who had no interest in democracy. And so why would we imagine that it's the best that it could be when that's where it came from? Remember, the Bill of Rights was the concession that they allowed to get the thing passed. That wasn't even what they originally wanted in it. And when we think of the Constitution, that's what we imagine the Constitution is, but that wasn't even their first draft, right? So there's a lot of changes we need, and a constitutional convention could be an exciting, amazing, democratic, visionary opportunity that this country hasn't had yet on the part of the public, but we haven't built a country that could actually do that and bring a justice solution. Instead, I think it would be really scary right now, so that's the work that we need to do, and sorry to take some time, but I think this is a kind of a complicated thing that comes up all the time, so I'd love to hear what you want to add.
Sure. I'll say that in the past, when we were working in the legislature, Move to Amend has come to our aid, which was really great. Now I think it was part of the Corvallis team, but anyway, there was a couple people working with us, and that was really awesome, and we so appreciated that. And I'm really familiar with Darla, who's the Portland leader, and I'm excited at the opportunity to maybe help her out as well with some of the specific projects that she's going to be working on. So I'm looking forward to, we have limited resources, we're all volunteers, but I'm looking forward to working with Move to Amend in ways that in whatever way we can help. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. And then as far as the Article 5 convention is concerned, we're obviously very excited about the possibility of pushing Congress into action with getting as many convention calls as possible. And as far as like a legal review of the support of an Article 5 convention, that's going to be a pretty timely deal. But just to hit on it, Article 5 is very specific in that the convention only has one power, which is to propose an amendment. And the Founding Fathers put 4 branches of government in charge of checks and balances on that convention, including the delegates of the convention, the states, the Supreme Court, and Congress. All have checks on each other throughout the process. So I'll just leave it at that because I don't want to make it a forever conversation. But certainly we're feel it's very, very safe and secure to use this path, and we're excited about the populist nature of it as well. So.
Okay, so one more question, and then this is what I want to do is I want to do a 1-minute wrap up, and I want to take it around because I don't want to neglect anybody up here. This is a very important panel, but I do have one more question for the panelists, and
I'm interested in the concept of Eric Richardson of working the environment with the NAACP. I think that this could really focus a lot of the injustice issues together, looking at social, racial, economic, and environmental all together. And also bring in a lot of marginalized communities that maybe aren't going to be too active in our voting system. So I'm wondering, you have proposed it here locally, and I think maybe it's starting locally, but is there a national force that's doing this as well?
So yes, the national NAACP has decided at a national level that they will be making a push into the EJ and climate change arena. They have they have established a department at the NAACP out of Baltimore. That director, her name is Jacqueline Patterson, and she will be visiting our town with Community Rights Lane County and the NAACP in February. She's an African-American woman who's done work in Africa with women's rights and many issues so we're talking about health, environment, racial justice, the idea of breaking down silos, of really talking about educating people to the intersectionality of that work. I think this is what we're going to need to do so that we can build this grassroots movement of informed, educated voters. And so this is really what we want to do. And I think just getting into the EJ arena is acknowledging the coming green energy economy, and the fact that traditionally when new economies come up, people of color have been left behind. And we want to make sure that we're not left behind in that conversation as well, as far as local incentives and things that people of color can get involved with. So there's just a lot of layers to this NAACP getting involved with EJ. And learning from these great organizations is going to help us do that and navigate as we move forward. So.
So I'll just say we do have a bit more time if you wanted to take it. So we can go, well, as late as 5 o'clock if we needed to.
Okay, okay. So, well, let me ask, are there any other questions for any other panelists? Questions back there? Okay.
I'll go with you first since you had one from earlier, and then you. Yeah.
So I'll direct this to the bus project. What's your name? Gnora, thank you. I think that the youth, I mean, for me, it's so important that the messaging is right too, and that we're framing this issue. So when we had Measure 98 lose in this last time, and it
97?
Well, the one with the corporations.
Yeah, Measure 97.
97,
yeah,
sorry. Measure 98, yeah. Measure 97, and the issue around they were able to separate out, and people were confused, I think, about the anti-business category, that, oh, this is going to hurt my small business, when it wouldn't have hurt their small business.
Right.
But once the word was out there and the corporation word was used, which I've been a small business person with my husband. We had a limited liability corporation. You know, I mean, there's a lot of people that are involved in corporations and employ people. And so it's easily twisted in the minds of people. So I'm worried that we're too focused on the corporation and not enough on the domination, that it's a dominating force that has been part of our economy and has been since, well, there's been domination for a long time, so way beyond my memory. So anyway, the domination as opposed to partnership. So do you think that more of a message of how domination is hurting all of us, nature, people, environment, could speak more clearly to this issue to the younger voter?
I'm not really sure about that. I actually think that the best way to appeal to younger voters is to engage them peer-to-peer. So I think when I talk to young people about corporate taxation, I think I have a pretty successful conversation with them because I am also a young person. We talk about, you know, what that's going to affect and what they care about, and how the things that they care about are going to be affected by taxation and by the budget cut programs. And actually a lot of young people are really with us on that. They're actually really, really against, you know, the current budget crisis. You know, they think that 97 should have passed, and that we should be able to implement more social justice-oriented laws. But then we have to actually talk to them about it. And I think people often, I think especially older folks, are afraid to talk to young people in a way that treats them like they're actual adults. So I actually have conversations with high school students all of the time. We're starting high school clubs now to talk about what's going on in a way that empowers them to feel like they're a change maker, to talk to them about what ways authentically they can get involved in the movement, giving them options. And then at the end of the day, I let them make the decisions. I talk to them like they are adults, and then they treat me like I am also an adult, and we move forward in that way, that we're peers together. I think you lose young people when you try and treat us like young people. That is the #1 way that you're gonna lose us in that conversation, is to treat us like we don't know what we're talking about, or that the messaging that is being used for adults for some reason doesn't work on anyone younger than 30, or anyone who's 18. I think we do understand the intricacies of the world that we live in, but it's really, really off-putting for any young person to feel like adults don't think that we have that ability. And we are the largest generation, millennials right now, we're the largest generation currently living. And we do have a lot of power. The problem is that people aren't talking to us like we have a lot of power. They're not talking to us like we're smart, living adult humans who have our own personalities and our own opinions that are formulated based off of our own experiences and our education. And when you actually do that, when you actually sit down with a young person and you talk to them about their power and talk to them about the issues in their community, they have really, really informed opinions that are educated and well-versed, and you would be surprised by the ability of an 18 or a 16-year-old to talk about corporate tax law. And I say that as someone who does not consider myself an expert in tax law. So yeah, I think you just have to give them a chance, and you have to talk to them like they are your peer.
Before we get to the next question, let me do this. From your particular organization or your particular view as part of your individual organization or your vision, what do you conceive to be the most relevant impact that your organization have in regards to the environment? And what I'd like to do is just do this as a 1-minute response so that I can get everybody's response on this. Based on your organization, your vision, how do you see your organization and the impact or influence on the environment as we're looking at today and for the future?
Alan Zundel, Equal Vote Coalition, by opening up the voting process so that people can more clearly express their opinions on different candidates, you'd probably have more candidates with more views coming out, and the views of the people would be better expressed and get into the legislature and be represented there if we didn't have the current voting system, which kind of shuttles people into one system with very few choices.
Well, I originally got into working with Wolfpack because of the environmental issues, and I saw that, for example, the insanely profitable oil companies getting subsidies just didn't make any sense to me, and it seemed like that was directly, excuse me, directly related to just the fact that they're able to lobby for whatever they need. So I wanted to hit at that power base so that we can get some more sensible subsidies levels for maybe other things that aren't so profitable, and also so that our incredibly powerful country that can be incredibly short-sighted on the highest levels could actually get us an energy infrastructure that will make sense in 100 or 200 years. So yeah, getting at that, you know, the root of what influences our government, our politicians in Washington, D.C., so that they can feel freed up to do things that make sense. You know, take away those subsidies and get the energy infrastructure that our children and grandchildren are really going to need.
Well, I already got the privilege of speaking to this a little bit based on people's questions. I'm Kaitlin from Move to Amend. But if corporations don't have constitutional rights, then it would allow our local communities and our states and the federal government, if we got it to do so, to actually really expand the way we think about protecting the environment versus profit. And right now, just any environmental regulation or law or effort to protect the environment or for environmental justice, so also to protect people who are in the most polluted places and things like that, is just subject to being overturned and told, us being told that that's actually unconstitutional because it violates the corporation's rights. So to me, I also am kind of most motivated by climate change, actually, and I don't think we're going to be able to do anything about climate change until corporations, the wealthy corporations that are running our government, are not doing that. And I live in California that's been on fire this year, and it's really, really scary, and we have to do something about it 10 years ago, and yet I think we need this amendment before that's actually going to happen, which is really terrifying. But that's why we got to get it done, I guess.
Thanks. Eric with the NAACP. So I think our greatest influence will be just bringing more people to the conversation. People who have been traditionally left out of this conversation, we want to bring to bear, understanding that worldwide people of color are going to suffer. Frontline communities with the raising sea levels and all the issues around pollution do affect people of color. Bangladesh, for instance. So there are millions of people that, as a person of color in the United States, I want to use my citizen, the rights of being a citizen here, to affect people outside the United States and really look out and raise their voices as well. So I just think that having people of color become more engaged with that is going to swell the ranks of the fighters for environmental justice. And so that's really what we're about. And I also wanted to talk about this idea of dominance and how small business has been usurped by corporate ideas. It's the same thing with declaring whiteness thing. The white landowner who owns this big swath of land, you too can be white, poor white person, and get all the benefits of being white. So this is the same ploy that they're using on the small business owners. You too can get a thing as a corporate. You are different than them. You are one of us. And so these corporations are not. And so that's just.
Totally. So Gnora, Gumanow with the Bus Project, I think research has really shown that when young people turn out to vote, we turn out to vote for the environment. So our role in climate change and climate justice is to register as many young people and make sure that not only are they registered, but they have the ability to turn out in the ballot.
James Barber, our Revolution, Lane County. And we're just passionate about people getting involved. We want to see more voices at the table and more people having dialogue. It's through that dialogue that we can regain and realize the humanity that other people have and get past the labels that are just tossed around. Beyond our Revolution, Lane County, I've hosted, I think, 8 activist connection events around this state. I try and rotate them around the state every month. And what we try and do at those is connect activists and progressive groups and other grassroots groups all around the state, so that when we do have these conversations and we do realize that we can work together on these issues, we can function as a larger coalition to pass bills and to make progress on all these issues that will protect the environment, stop the Jordan Cove pipeline, save the Elliott, things like that. So that's what we're doing. We're just trying to get everybody working together on these issues.
David, excuse me, David Tvedt, Community Rights, Lane County. I think one of the really strong aspects of the community rights approach is showing people in local communities that we can stand up to preemption laws. We're getting more and more painted into corners and into strangleholds with more and more preemption laws that the corporations and moneyed interests are getting passed through legislatures and so forth. And I think it can apply across a huge range of issues. Of course, environmental issues where it's mostly been used so far, but also I was reading an article in These Times. It's a progressive magazine, and about I think it was Montgomery and Birmingham, Alabama, efforts to try to get minimum wages up, and they were getting preemption laws put on them, and perhaps a community right approach could be one more way to fight that. And I think we need to fight corporate power and moneyed interest power from all different angles, not just from a community rights approach, but from all different angles, and yeah, and win.
Before we got involved with the Ariel Spring issue, Community Rights Lane County was involved in a farming issue that involves Monsanto and some of the big boys. And in getting closer with farmers, quite a few of them, I began to realize how critical to a healthy city, how critical to a healthy country, how critical to a healthy culture is our farmland and our farmers. And among other things that we have lost to the corporations, we have lost, I mean, Eugene area and Portland area, you know, we're the best in the world, literally. But there's a lot of places where farmers are lost to the culture. A friend of mine, a young friend of mine, I live rurally, by the way. I live on a small farm. A young friend of mine who lived nearby once said, man, if they could just get these kids in the inner cities and difficult places out here on the river. This guy grew up fishing and hunting. Get them out here on the river, just fishing. It would change everything. That was an ideal thought, but I think you know what I mean by the thought. We cannot be a healthy culture without farmers. And to be honest, Eric, you know, this is Lane County. There's not a lot of black folk here. But I've never known a young black person to be a farmer. And I think that's so essential to our health.
Black folks don't get to own land like that historically.
A generational farmer, African American here in Lane County. I met with them. They're like third generation. I meet with them often with everybody in my farming community because my district is urban and rural. So I meet with my farmers at least quarterly. And we do have a black family. Actually, he's a graduate of U of O, and he gets around. I think they have a new coalition or something that he is the chair of. So awesome. I was just like you. I was amazed to find that out.
Great.
And I will just let you know that we did last year. We stood up a health committee, and we do have a young man named J.R. Morgan who's really supporting farming, organic farming, and nutrition. And so this is something that we want to support, and we support young people get involved. And it's a slow process, but I agree. African peoples came to this country as agriculturalists. In a lot of ways, we've lost touch with that history.
And maybe one of the biggest rip-offs was the 40 acres and the mule deal never happened.
I agree.
Yeah, you got to own land.
Along with all the rest of the rip-offs, maybe we'd have a long-term tradition if that promise had been fulfilled.
Thank you. Great. The question back here.
Yes. Hi. I'm Marcia Stewart from a group called Rural Oregon Progressives, and we're located in the rural parts of East Lynn County. And I wanted to address my question to Gnora about the bus project. I really appreciate that you find that that's your most important issue, is the lack of engagement of people, the voters, and also community involvement. Our group is working, every month we put on a presentation at our local community college to educate our voters. We invite the community, sometimes we do press releases, we try to get the word out. Our last one was Medicare for All, and we do, just every month it's something or another. And what we're lacking in the rural areas are educated speakers. Your bus project, you mentioned to me that it's in the Portland area. Mm-hmm. We're having a hard time, our group, being as we're progressives in a conservative community, we're not welcome to come into our schools and speak to the students.
Right.
Is there anybody with your organization? We want to enlist these students. We want them to get active. That's where our communities are going to see the change. Do you have people that will come to the rural areas and talk to our students? And could you also explain in January what age you're going to be able to register to vote?
Yeah, thanks. We were having a conversation out in the hallway, so thank you for bringing those questions back up to the group. So we are based in the Portland metro area. The bus project has gone through growths and some downsizing and growths and downsizing, just like any organization that's new. We're just turning 16 in March. So right now we are a skeleton staff. We have 3 staff members. We do grow in the summer when we hire all of our Politicor fellows, and then during election time we have some extra staff members. But right now it's just 3. It's me, I'm the policy and advocacy director, our interim executive director, and our leadership development director. So we do tend to focus mostly on the Tri-County area because it is easy to get to, and there's a high concentration of schools in that area, and a lot of students that we can talk to. I'm not opposed to spending a day in a rural area if I can get classes scheduled, but I do also face those same hurdles of having teachers or schools out in rural areas that don't want to hear from the progressive change-making youth organization in their classrooms, regardless of whether or not everything we're talking about is nonpartisan and 501c3 appropriate. So we do face that, I think, same hurdle, but I think if we could get classes scheduled for an entire day, it would be totally worth taking a trip out to rural Oregon to talk to those young people. And then the second question that you had was about what age can vote in January, and we're really excited about this. As part of automatic voter registration, you know how you go to the DMV when you're 16 to get your driver's license, and then, like I said, I never went to the DMV back until like 2 months ago because I had to renew it. That means that we're missing a whole bunch of students who at 17 are not going to be going to the DMV because they already have their driver's license. So the bus project in the last legislative session, 2017, we passed pre-registration of 16-year-olds, which means that when you are 16, starting January 1st, you can pre-register to vote. You will not get a ballot until you are eligible to vote. So those voters registering in January, their first election, will be probably the November 2020 election, which is also the census and presidential combined election, very important. So we will be starting a really cool competition called Democracy Bowl to kick off the implementation of pre-registration of 16-year-olds. So we're having high schools compete to see who can register the most students, and there are prizes involved. It's pretty exciting.
Excellent.
I'm sorry, really quick. So there may be other books out there, but specifically to campaign finance reform, if you're trying to talk with conservative folks or understand the conservative perspective on the issue, John Pudner wrote an amazing book called Taxation Only with Representation. It is the campaign finance reform from the conservatives' perspective. And it's not just a liberal or progressive issue. It is absolutely a conservative issue as well. I read the book and I absolutely loved it, and it'll really help you engage in conversations with conservatives, because the campaign finance system the way it is now does not serve rural Oregonians. It doesn't serve just the normal run-of-the-mill conservatives down where I live, down Southern Oregon. So fantastic book, Taxation Only with Representation. So for what's worth.
Thank you, thank you. That's really important, and I don't want us. I want everybody to understand that we're all, as Eric has said, that we're all in this thing together. So a little bit. My district is Eugene, Northwest Eugene. That includes River Road, Santa Clara, Bethel, Churchill, the Wit. Love the Wit. Are any of the Wit in here? All right, all right. All right, and up to Junction City, and I have a substantial farming community, and they're generational farmers and stuff. So I'm really concerned about all of my constituents, and even outside of my constituencies. So it's, you know, sometimes we don't see a lot of things if we don't engage people in a conversation. And I go out and I engage my farmers as often as I do everyone else in the urban centers as well. It's really important because I have to meet the needs of everybody. And I think that what we're hearing here from this panel was talking about engaging everyone in the communities because we're all in this together. They were trying to come up with solutions on how we can make access to the voters' files and registration easier. I do agree that, and I've been pushing to make sure that we have postage paid envelopes that go out with the ballots. And the challenge with that is that we do have a Secretary of State now that's doing things a little different. I'm definitely going to keep my eye on him. And the intent of that is that you can't be charged with a pre-post paid envelope unless it's used. So now we're talking about how the argument on why this is a good thing, because as you mentioned, could be conceived as a poll tax, a way to stop people from voting. We're also looking at pre-registration, which that was a great piece. I think I carried that on the Senate floor too, I'm not sure, but that's great. So when students go out there to register to get to take the driver's test, they can pre-register. And then it's automatically done. So we still have some things that we can improve upon. So my question to the panel up here, and I'm going to just throw this out here and give you 1 minute to kind of give it your best shot. How do we make access to voting easier for people not only in the urban centers, but also in the rural centers? Who wants to go first?
I can answer. I think there's some experts here on like the right now things that could happen, but I just want to throw out there that we definitely need a constitutional right to vote in the Constitution. Because without that, we don't have the fundamental justification for, say, like a more uniform system across the country. Or also the situation that happened in 2000 with Bush v. Gore, where we had the Supreme Court install our president because the voters in Florida whose votes actually weren't counted could not actually claim that their constitutional rights were violated as a result of the shenanigans there, and actually every presidential election we've had since then too. And probably before that, but that was my first presidential election I voted in, so that's when I was paying attention. So this is, again, like props to the folks who are working on it right now under the current conditions, but also just want to put out there the sort of more systemic solution to the voting rights issue is that we need a constitutional right to vote so that we actually can sue our government when our vote is not counted. And it should go beyond just a general constitutional right to vote, but also to vote and be counted. And we could also put language in there that would maybe even go further, that would kind of lay the groundwork for, having more than 2 political parties and the election infrastructure, making sure that the votes are counted in a way that shows our full choices, not just the lesser of 2 evils, and et cetera, et cetera. So that would be my answer as the amendment person.
Well, okay, so Phil with Wolfpack here. And, speaking of taxation with representation, that conservative book about campaign finance reform, it just brings to mind the solution they had in there, which was taking out of the federal government's coffers a certain amount from every voter from their taxes that they're already giving to the federal government, and using that as a pool, and then it's like a voucher where they could give it to whatever candidates they want to help fund their campaigns. And the cool thing about that is it takes this, it would be this huge force for actually helping like choose and drive the campaigns of candidates, not just voting for them. And it could give every single one of us a voice in how our candidates are chosen and how they drive their campaigns, instead of giving that all over to, you know, these huge fundraisers that, you know, Hollywood stars or wherever the Koch brothers decide to gather. You know, it would be nice to, in underground dens, yeah. So anyway, that's our perspective, but I know you guys have more like direct answers, so I'll pass it along.
Well, I just wanted to acknowledge Senator Wyden's bill, House bill. I can't remember what House bill the number was, but it's called the National Vote by Mail Act. And so the idea of instituting vote by mail nationwide would go a long way to fixing some of the issues. So just want to point to that, and if you guys want to let him know you support that and others, do that.
I think that there are a lot of ways you can improve things on the immediate level, like national vote by mail and decreasing some of the intimidation tactics you see in the other states around voting. I think also we have to talk about how our democracy is currently structured. I think the first past the post system is sometimes catering towards communities that are highly privileged, as opposed to folks, our greater community, and representing everyone who actually lives in our community. And so on the long term, re-examining our entire democracy structure is what's going to really amplify our voice. But I think doing things on the short term, like empowering OHA to do automatic voter registration so that everyone who interacts with Medicaid is automatically registered to vote, would be a huge step forward, as well as making sure that every single person who is eligible to vote gets a ballot in the mail, and then they can mail it back, and having a national holiday around Election Day so that those working families don't have to take an entire day off to stand in the poll lines.
There's so many good ideas on how to improve our voting system, and it's clear that we need to do something. I want to talk about something that we're working on right now. What I would like to see here in Oregon, we have the vote by mail, which is awesome, and it gets us a very large turnout in the general election. The problem is we have closed primaries, and the closed primaries don't allow non-affiliated voters to become engaged in the process until it's really, really late in the election cycle. And it's just a huge turnoff. There's so many young people, and Motor Voter, there's 350,000 new voters signed up because of Motor Voter. Just over 40% of those are under 30. These are people that they're not engaged in party politics. They don't know if they want to be a part of a party. A lot of them don't want to be affiliated with any party. But not allowing them to participate is not the answer to getting more people to be involved. If we can open up the primaries, at least what we have the ability to do as a Democratic Party, which is what I'm affiliated with, is a semi-open primary. We can allow the non-affiliated voters a chance to participate in the Democratic Party primary. I think that's critical to engaging these young people who have no idea what party represents them the best. They don't know our candidates. They're not going to look at our candidates until the general election right now. The sooner that they have the opportunity to see the platform and the issues that are being fought for on their behalf, the sooner they're going to get engaged and invested in the political process. And the one other thing I like to see, Brad Avakian, he unfortunately lost to Dennis Richardson, but he had a wonderful idea in engaging more civics classes in the schools and actually getting ballots out to our kids in school. They won't count, they'll count up the ballots, it won't count towards the result, but it gets them into the habit of voting. And if we can get them into the habit of voting and looking at the candidates and paying attention to the issues, they're going to continue to do that when they get out of school. So.
David Tvedt, Community Rights, Lane County. I don't have a lot to add. There's been a lot of great things said. Very complicated issues, and what I've been seeing some states doing to repress the vote for purely partisan issues, I think that seriously needs to be addressed. And of course, the Supreme Court ruling and other things. So, but anyway, yeah, I'm encouraging perhaps some kinds of civics classes that would actually re-engage students with our political process again too, and them somehow getting hope of that it isn't just a hopeless system. That's a real hard sell. So, anyway.
Speaking of hopeless systems, I'm going to address a slightly different angle on voting, and that is through the initiative process, which is a sacrosanct thing that belongs to the people of Lane County and the people of Oregon. I'm serious when I say that our county commissioners have obstructed us in exercising our state-given, our Constitution-given rights to follow through with what is lawful, all of the procedures in getting an initiative on the ballot for the people to vote thumbs up or thumbs down. Okay. To me, we can sit here all day long and be critical of government, or we can go down and let the commissioners what we think of the way it's come down. We could write a letter to the editor. You could speak to David or myself about this, but please be heads up about the initiative process here. How many people know that several months ago, 6 months ago in fact, the commissioners tried to assume rights to decide what initiatives go on the ballot? Okay, great. Well, what do I expect? You know, you're all conscious people here. Thank you. And please continue to support your initiative process and keeping it clean and righteous and belonging to the people. It is one of our rare direct democratic tools.
Okay, so thanks everybody for coming here. So let's all thank our panelists. And